So we're based in near Bath. We were set up just over 25 years ago by a group of Christian West Country farmers who literally did send cows on a plane to Uganda in response to need. And I think a few people may know the story. But now our work is much broader than that. And we've heard today a lot about hope. That's a big part of our work, is to bring hope. A big part of it is to change mindset. And a big part is to bring communities together where there is conflict. So I'm not going to say more. I'm going to ask Andre a couple of questions. Andre is the country director of Rwanda and Burundi. So I think it's really good to listen to him. You should listen to him because he's a good man. You should listen to him because he works in countries where all that we're talking about really matters. He lives in Burundi, his family are there now, and if I could describe his job spec, it would be turning swords into ploughshares through his work. So if we can just welcome Andre. Andre, would you just give us a little bit of an understanding of kind of where Burundi is and what the current context of the country is?
Good morning, everyone. Burundi is a small country landlocked in the East Africa, great region. We've got Tanzania in the east, Rwanda in the north, and the DRC in Democratic Republic of Congo in the west. And Burundi has been experiencing a long civil war in the 90s that ended in 2008. But since last year, we are unfortunately starting another crisis. This one is a more political one, while the previous one had really a very big, important ethnic conflict component. But the current one is more political because our president didn't want to leave when he ended his second term.
And what's it like to live there day to day at the moment in Bujumbura?
It's still difficult because Bujumbura has been, like any other capital, is most active in terms of political protestation. So Burundi protested really when the president decided to stand for the third term, and strongly, because churches, political parties, civil society organizations, everybody stands and say, we don't want a third term. So, and of course, because the police and the army, the man was able to stay. And
just briefly, some of you will have been to the seminar on refugees. Can you explain in Bujumbura, in Burundi, what that looks like?
Yeah, it's hard because the conflict has caused 650,000 people who are affected by the crisis right now. All of them are not refugees. 230,000 are currently in refuge. 120 in Tanzania, 70 or 75,000 in Rwanda, 40,000 in DRC, some in Uganda, and some even reported in Zambia, Zambia and Uganda are quite far from Burundi. So it's a really challenging situation. And even inside Burundi, there are internal displaced people. My colleague, Paul, who spoke about the refugees crisis, spoke about the internal displaced people. There are many in Burundi who are really inside and hiding.
Okay, thank you. Today, a lot of what we're doing is thinking about how we can impact on change, how we can bring peace where there is conflict. And as I said, Andre, that's his job. That's what he puts his best time and his best skills to in Burundi and Rwanda. Can I just ask you in probably 2 minutes to explain how the work that you do with Sendekau helps bring peace?
Yeah, thank you. The work of Sendekau looks like a bit strange when it comes to conflict, but our role is ending poverty. and tackling poverty is somehow contributing to peace. It has been confirmed that poverty is like a catalyst, a fuel for conflict. And Sendeka is trying to address different kind of conflict. In Burundi, we are having this political conflict, but we also have social conflict linked, for example, to gender issues, domestic violence and others, but also resources-based conflict like land. So Sendeka is tackling those things, first bringing people together, working on the same, bring them, they are already organized in associations. Where they are not, we try to bring them together, and then work on mindset. Once people are really finding that there is a common space where they can live together, that is bringing peace into the communities. Our mission is to give communities and the families hope and the means to secure their futures from the land. And we work a lot on bringing hope into communities. We've seen through our years of work that within a year, those people we work with who are the poorest actually in the communities, at the beginning they are desperate. They don't see any future at the beginning, but within 1 year, we've seen that more than 90% of them have hope. They express that they have hope. They see the future, which is becoming bright. And that is changing everything in terms of their mindset, in terms of hating others, in terms of considering that the other one is the cause of my problem. Taking actually the responsibility of myself and of the past. So that is really huge in terms of bringing peace into a country of conflict, like where we operate now.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's brief. I would encourage you, as I think Dan said earlier, to go around the stands later. Do come and spend some time with Andre. Do talk, do listen, and above all, pray, because some of these issues are bigger than, many of these issues are bigger than we can understand, but with God, things are possible. So do pray for Andre before he returns to Burundi. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's my privilege now to introduce to you Joel Edwards. In addition to his extensive and professional experience spanning over a decade as General Director of the Evangelical Alliance in the UK and in leading the Micah Challenge International, Joel has served on a number of government bodies, including as a Commissioner on the Equality and Human Rights Commission here in the UK, and on the Advisory Board on Human Rights and Religious Freedom within the British and Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and the Metropolitan Police's Independent Advisory Group. He's also a freelance broadcaster with the BBC, a published author, and international speaker on a wide range of issues, including current affairs, religious freedom, biblical teaching, issues of justice and leadership, and a faith-based response to human rights. I've heard Joel speak on numerous occasions, Springs Harvest, Salvation Army Roots, many different occasions, and I've always been inspired by what he has to say to us. So will you welcome him now as he comes to speak to us this morning? Thank you.
Fantastic. So I was saying good afternoon. I wondered why you didn't answer me before. I've been trying to get a new thing going of preachers sitting to preach, and it hasn't caught on yet. But now I have the perfect excuse. I have a little bit of a back thing going, and 30 minutes is just a little outside my comfort zone. So I'm trying again, authentically, to get the preaching sitting down thing going. It's a real privilege to be here. Since arriving this morning, I have just been so inspired by all that I have heard. I'd like to accuse the organizers of just a touch of mental and intellectual torment, because it's not fair having 5 great seminars and you can only choose 2. That's kind of mental harassment, I think. But they're also very canny, I have discovered, because to put the preacher on just before lunch is a smart move, very smart move. So I'm going to try to be sensitive to that and keep an eye on my time. Your theme, our theme, really struck me quite deeply and took me to the text, or one of the 3 options we could turn to. This is Isaiah 2, verse 4. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. And they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. A nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. It's a great ideal, a really, really big vision. Similar texts can be found in Joel chapter 3, verse 10, and Amos chapter 4, although in Joel's version, it's inverted. They will turn their plowshares into swords for very different kind of exegetical and contextual reasons, I imagine. But it's a big theme, and it's so typical of God that ever so often, in fact, throughout the whole of the Bible, he gives us these big ideas we can hardly ever really fit into. It seems to me that most of the Bible and most of what God has in mind is similar to parents who dress their kids in school clothes 2 years bigger than their age. You know that feeling? You always expect them to grow into the clothes. There is a sense in which the vision and the mission of God is always bigger than us. We're always likely to feel as if we're swimming around in it because it is so enormous. Every time I hear this text and this idea of beating swords into plowshares, I think of 2 things. One is the example which we had. I've never seen it, but heard of it from Shane Claiborne, who actually had somebody literally convert a weapon of war, an AK-47, into a tool for harvesting, for farming. And the second is, if you ever visit the United Nations, you will see this text emblazed in a very public place. This humongous sense of vision and aspiration, which calls us way beyond our natural capacity, it seems to do so. But it's always been the case. I was very encouraged and inspired by the recognition that just when we thought there was room for a tremendous amount of pessimism, 1944 it was precisely the time when President Roosevelt had a big vision. His vision was a world free with freedom of speech, a world where people had the freedom to believe, a world with freedom from fear, a world with freedom from want. You probably recognize that as some of the cornerstone of what the United Nations subsequently aspires to help human beings achieve together. Not necessarily successful in every instance, but that's the aspiration. And so this big theme is something God calls us to try to inhabit. And it happens from time to time that we latch on to this swords into plowshare idea by campaigns which we come up with. So Rachel Carnegie was just reminding us a while ago in the SDG seminar of the Jubilee 2000 campaign. How many of you ever got involved with that? This huge biblical motif, which oddly enough, we never ever find out if the people of Israel ever really did. But the whole Jubilee theme would have made Israel the most progressive political entity that ever lived. Jubilee 2000. How about this one? Make poverty history. How many folks were there in your white t-shirts in, was it Edinburgh? All milling around for a great day. When I was there in Edinburgh on our Make Poverty History big day, I thought to myself, this is probably one of the most biblical conferences I have ever been to, even though nobody opened a Bible and a lot of the people we were dealing with were non-Christians. It just seemed something about that environment where people were trying to live up to a big aspiration, make poverty history. Intellectually, politically, economically perhaps, most of us would probably think that's not gonna happen anytime soon. But there we were in our white t-shirts. I forgot mine. I was in blue, I think. Making this aspiration something we were all trying to live up to. And that's right. It's right that we should keep reminding ourselves that God calls us to these big, big ideas. But here's a challenge for the church. Is this a big idea, turning swords into plowshares, which is exclusive for Christians? Very often in the work we do, I find that Christian communities have, if not consciously, at least subliminally, this idea that we are going to fix the world all by ourselves. In fact, sometimes I do get the impression that there are those pockets of Christian activism which says, well, we don't really trust governments. They all tell a bunch of lies. You can't really trust them because they change every 5 years, and all of our politicians are nice guys and gals maybe, but you can't really trust them, apart from people like Steve Webb, of course. So we, the church, will just get on with it, do it all by ourselves, because after all, the church is the hope of the world. One of the things I now do, I know people often talk about me in terms of the past. I'm the ex-director of the Evangelical Alliance and the ex-director of Micah Challenge, which is probably really just trying to keep my credentials alive. I'm not sure. One of the things I'm very proudly associated with now is being an advisor to Christian Solidarity Worldwide, which looks very much at the whole issue of the persecuted church. But we also want to look at religious freedom for all, irrespective of faith, creed, or culture. If you want to know more about my context, we do have a stand at the back with my colleague Jenny, Heather rather, who is actually able to tell you a little bit more. And what fascinates me about this work, as it did with Micah Challenge, as it did with the Evangelical Alliance, as with many of us here, is that we are trying to live down that misconception. The fact is that God has called the whole of humanity to the task of fixing the broken world. So we are all in the business of fixing it all together. I think Karl Barth was right when he said that believers are called, what believers are called to, he said, is no different from what all humanity is called to do. And I would like to suggest to us that the notion that Christians should fix the world all by ourselves is politically naive, it's impractical, and more than anything else, it's profoundly unbiblical. In fact, everyone is called to fix the world, and my conviction is that Christians are probably the only ones God will not exempt. That's the difference. If we have a compulsion, if the church is the hope of the world, it is because we have no exemption clause from fixing the world, because we have been informed directly by a mandate from God to the church, to the world, to be a part of this great fixing enterprise. And I think this is something we need to get hold of. That's why we write our letters to our politicians. That's why we join hands with secular outfits to talk about making poverty history. That's why we do advocacy at the political level, locally and nationally and globally. That's why we fund organizations and ministries exhibiting in this hall today who can take up the cause and interact with institutions who have a God-given responsibility to ensure that indeed we are aspiring to turn swords into plowshares for the benefit of everybody concerned. When I sat with colleagues from CSW in Washington to talk about the situation in India and in Sri Lanka, where people are being persecuted for their faith, Christians and others, I am delighted that we are doing this with political people and institutions who have a God-given responsibility to join God in turning swords into plowshares. And people are seeking to do that. And the church is increasingly beginning to learn that that is a part of our mandate. I call it the Cyrus syndrome. We will often think about Nehemiah and the rebuilding of the walls around Jerusalem. Why and how did he do it? Mandated and sent by God? Sure he was. Very strategic? Yep, sure he was. Prayerful? Absolutely, sure he was. But have you ever thought that the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem would have been entirely inconceivable had not a pagan king, Cyrus, who God later calls my servant Cyrus, had given him all the resources and letters of consent for safe travel? Without those permission from the ruling monarch, Nehemiah's mission would have been virtually impossible. When people who go to church a lot say that we can fix the world by ourselves, I don't think Amos would have recognized that. I don't think Hosea and Micah or Jeremiah would have understood that. I don't even think the New Testament writers would have understood that, because when the New Testament writers in James and Peter's letters tells us, pray for those who exercise authority. When Paul in Romans 13 tells us about godly government and our responsibility to pray for good government, if you are in a totally dictatorial regime, your prayer is the most democratic thing you can do. It is the most political action you can take. And so we pray for governments, we work with governments, we work with institutions even beyond the church, because we recognize something which is quite important. God has mandated humankind who share the image of God to fix things. And God has, perhaps in a very, very special and grace-given way, filled the church with the energy of the mandate, the work and guidance of the Spirit to be a catalyst with many others. That's why it's such great news that the church is increasingly seeing her role on the main stages of transformational work. Let's debunk this idea that God has called us to stand apart from institutions and non-Christian NGOs and civil society and fix the world by ourselves and see ourselves as partners in God's mission, working with anybody, everybody who shares the image of God to turn swords into plowshares. But here's the next thing. It's a very long road, because fixing doesn't mean fixed. I think the world arms trade is worth something like $1.5 trillion, 2.7% of GDP. And when we look at what is happening across our world, it is very easy to become discouraged. I missed our opening session this morning, but I gather that the tone of what was presented to us was this: we're not people who give up, we are people of hope. We don't get overwhelmed with the issues. We bring hope and practical response to intimidating and entrenched circumstances. That's what we bring to the party. And we bring a recognition that God is in for the long game. I once had the privilege of standing by the graveside and the gravestone of Billy Graham's wife, Ruth. Here's what's written on her tombstone, which I really love. Ruth Bell Graham, June the 10th, 1920 to June 2007. Quote, end of construction. Thank you for your patience. I love that. She recognized that all through her life, she was a work in progress. And that's what God is doing in his world. We don't get discouraged or disheartened because we're not naive. We're not some kind of outfit which runs into the rough and tumble of life thinking that we're going to fix it by next week. We know the deep nature of human sin and sinfulness. If anybody gets it, we get it. If anybody should understand that this is a long game in which God is doing his work inexorably, but sometimes with huge discouragement and with a great deal of effort, we get it. Because we know that fixing something isn't the same as something fixed. Yesterday I was at a very important meeting at Westminster Central Methodist. I'm going to get my notes. And it was a great occasion because we were in a church, which I thought was fantastic, reminding ourselves that 70 years ago, the United Nations First General Assembly was held at Westminster Central Methodist Hall. Did you know that? 1st of February this year was the 70th anniversary. Here's what Baroness Ainley, from the Minister for the FCO, said. When she looked across the world and evaluated all that was still happening, before we heard from the Secretary General yesterday, who was our key guest in a very packed church hall, she said this: sadly, the challenges we face show no signs of abating. This is incredible. Because somehow we are expected to hold this tension between the people who are passionate about turning swords into plowshares and recognizing the incredibly overwhelming realities in our world. We've looked at some of them today. The rise of extremism, with apparently no easy answers. The migrant refugee crisis across Europe. The escalation in trafficking, despite some gallant and amazing responses from places like IJM. The incredible inequalities, north and south divides within nations and across our globe, which continues despite the energy and work of ministries like Christian Aid for many years. The picture gets gloomier and gloomier and gloomier. And yet, we are the people who are called to bring hope. And it's great news. It's great news, especially if you happen to be evangelicals, because we're very good at bad news, usually. I often say a great evangelical sermon is to paint the worst picture you can of the world, so then you can offer a better option than the sermon you've just preached. How is it in all of this madness, in all of this craziness, God has still called people to be emissaries of hope? I just think this is fantastic. That in all of this darkness, in all of this apparently intractable problems in our world, God has called us to make a difference. You know how we do that? It's by the eschatological dimension of our faith. I hope Christians don't lose sight of eschatology. I don't mean pre-millennium, post-millennium, a-millennium, any millennium. Whatever your theological categories about Jesus' return, and I hope we don't diminish that biblical and theological reality in our lifestyle, our worship, and so on. Whatever you make of the theology of Jesus coming again, this idea of hope is indispensable to our world. And hope is about the forgiveness of sin, the reign of God. The fact that, yes, we believe that one day in the unspecified future, God will move from fixing things to fixed things. And what the future does is calls us with energy and creativity and determination and tenacity in the present. Are these bunch of Christians naive? No, we are hope-filled and hopeful. And this is hope in the realities of our present world, turning swords into plowshares. This is what we just heard from Burundi a while ago. These little nuggets of hope. AJM rescuing 50 women from trafficking. Our various ministries doing those things which changes lives for the individual. So we are people of hope because we go for the big picture, but never at the expense of the intermediate and the small, these little gestures of swords into plowshares. Here's a gift I got from Australia the last time I was there. This is material recycled from a bombshell in Vietnam. I love this. You've probably got something like this as well, a little aluminium spoon. This used to be a bomb. Now I could use it for my cereals, which I don't. It's not much, is it? But it says a lot. This says hope. Hope is the prospect and the possibility of tomorrow. That's what hope is. That's God's gift to a dark world. People who believe that there is the possibility of life tomorrow. And that's what we bring to the party. And this hope expresses itself in practical ways. I'm going to finish in a couple of minutes, and I'm going to finish with a little prayer request for each of us. Because I'm fascinated too by Jesus' response to big eschatological issues. Matthew 24 is all about the last days. How will we know when you will come back again? The disciples asked Jesus. And then he goes into a series of stories in Matthew 25. And one of them is about the parable of the sheep and the goat. We all know it well. Those who passed the test stood on his right. Those who failed the test stood on his left. What was the test about? The test was about this. I was hungry. I was thirsty. I was in prison. I was naked. I began to think about this statement Jesus made once when he was talking about evangelism, the context of his disciples being cared for by those to whom they shared the word. And he said, if you give even a cup of water to the least of these, you will have your reward. And I began thinking about the cup. This is my second prop. The cup of water. Here are the things: hunger, prison, thirst, nakedness. These are such basic micro issues against the backcloth of massive impossibilities. And I believe what God is calling us to do, and I'm closing here in a couple of minutes. Did I say a couple of minutes 2 minutes ago? Is to embrace the doable. To embrace the doable. It was asked in Richard's seminar about extremism, and I heard it again in Rachel's presentation. What can I do? How can we avoid being overwhelmed? It's by embracing the doables. So I'm going to ask us as I close, what's doable for you in turning swords into plowshares? I'd like us just to spend a minute to pray. Some of us are privileged to do advocacy at high levels. Some of us run professionally agencies which respond to all kinds of needs. Many of us don't do that, and we're still asking, what can I do? But what's burning you? What's on your heart? What makes you angry? Bill Hybels once said, whatever it is that makes you angry, maybe that's God's way of speaking to you about what you should be doing. I say God moves in mysterious ways. He moves by His Spirit, and He can also use Google. If you've got a burn and a passion, somebody can help you do it. So here's how we're closing. If you would love to just stand right where you are and say, God, you know what? I want to embrace the doable, whatever that is. Would you stand where you are? It doesn't have to be a big deal. It's just a doable. It might mean making sure you walk around to the stands after we're finished and just look again and see who can help me do a doable. I believe together we will discover that we are slowly but powerfully turning swords into plowshares. This is where I get to enjoy the fact that you are standing and I'm still sitting. Lord, thank you that you are our God. You have called us into your world for your time. And we ask you, Holy Spirit, right now, as we have brought ourselves to be taught, to be inspired, to be motivated, that for each of us you would speak with renewed power and relevance and urgency about those things you would have us do. I thank you for those who have been at the cutting edge for many years. May they not become weary in well-doing. But for each of us, may we know your voice again, commissioning us in your world, turning swords into plowshares. We ask it for Jesus' sake. Everybody said.